James Carter walked into the airport, rolling his suitcase behind him. He had a flight to catch to New York for an important business meeting. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he exuded professionalism, but as he approached the security checkpoint, he noticed a uniformed officer eyeing him suspiciously. Officer Bradley, a veteran TSA agent with a history of overstepping his authority, stepped in front of James just as he was about to place his belongings on the conveyor belt. "You, step aside," Bradley ordered, pointing to a separate inspection area. James furrowed his brows. "Excuse me? Is there a problem?" Bradley crossed his arms. "Random screening?" he stated flatly, but James noticed how no one else around him was being stopped. A few people in line looked on with concern, some whispering among themselves. James sighed, already sensing where this was going. He had been through this too many times before. "Fine," James said, stepping aside. He had nothing to hide, but he knew arguing wouldn't get him anywhere. Bradley patted James down roughly, checking his pockets, shoes, and even running his hands through his neatly trimmed hair. The officer took his time, acting as if he were expecting to find something illegal. James remained calm but firm. "I hope you're treating everyone this thoroughly," Bradley smirked. "Just following protocol." Another officer, a younger woman named Officer Reed, watched from the side. She could tell something wasn't right. James was being singled out. Then something unexpected happened. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few swipes, he started recording. "This is racial profiling," he said clearly, making sure his voice was loud enough for others to hear. Bradley's smirk faded. The crowd grew silent, watching closely. Little did he know, James wasn't just any traveler. He was someone with the power to change everything. The moment James started recording, the energy in the airport shifted. Passengers who had been minding their own business began to pay closer attention. Some pulled out their own phones, sensing that something wasn't right. Officer Bradley's confidence wavered for a second, but he quickly put on a stern face. "Turn that off," he barked, stepping closer to James. James didn't budge. "I have every right to record this. I'm documenting an unlawful search." Officer Reed, still watching from the side, felt uneasy. She had seen Bradley push the boundaries before, but this time it felt different. The way James stood his ground with quiet confidence unsettled her. "Sir, you need to comply," Bradley insisted, his voice rising. "I have complied," James shot back. "You pulled me aside without reason, conducted an unnecessary search, and now you're trying to intimidate me. That's not protocol, that's profiling." Bradley's jaw tightened. He glanced around, realizing how many people were watching. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I'll need to check your bag," Bradley added, doubling down. James let out a slow breath. "Fine, but you better be ready for what happens next." As Bradley unzipped the suitcase, Officer Reed received a message in her earpiece. It was from her supervisor. "Step in, now." Reed hesitated for only a second before taking a step forward. "Officer Bradley, that's enough," she said, her voice steady but firm. Bradley shot her a sharp look. "Stay out of this." But Reed wasn't the only one moving. A man in a dark suit was walking toward them from the other side of the terminal, someone who could change the course of the entire situation. As Officer Bradley rummaged through James's bag, the man in the dark suit approached with purpose. His presence alone commanded attention. The badge clipped to his belt gleamed under the fluorescent airport lights. TSA Director David Holloway. Bradley, too focused on trying to justify his actions, didn't notice him at first, but Officer Reed did. She stiffened, knowing this wasn't just a routine intervention. "Officer Bradley," Holloway said, his voice calm but authoritative. Bradley's hands froze mid-search. He turned slowly, trying to suppress the panic creeping up his spine. "Sir?" "I'd like to know exactly why this passenger was pulled aside," Holloway continued, glancing briefly at James before returning his sharp gaze to Bradley. Bradley swallowed hard. "Routine security check, sir. Suspicious behavior." James let out a dry chuckle. "Suspicious how? Walking while black?" Holloway's expression darkened. "Is that true, officer?" Bradley hesitated. He could feel every pair of eyes in the terminal on him. His usual intimidation tactics weren't working, not with a high-ranking TSA official here. Reed decided to speak up. "Sir, I was present when Officer Bradley initiated the stop. There was no clear reason for it." Holloway's jaw tensed. He had seen cases like this before. cases that led to lawsuits, media scandals, and ruined careers. "Step away from the passenger," Holloway ordered. Bradley hesitated. "But sir—" "That's an order, officer." Bradley's face burned with anger and embarrassment. Slowly, he stepped back, his authority slipping away by the second. James zipped up his bag, standing tall. "Are we done here?" he asked. Holloway nodded. "For now. But Officer Bradley, we're going to have a conversation, a long one." Officer Bradley's heart pounded as Director Holloway gestured for him to follow. The entire terminal had gone silent, passengers whispering among themselves, some even recording the scene on their phones. James crossed his arms, watching the once confident officer shrink under the weight of his superior's gaze. He had seen this kind of abuse of power too many times, but rarely had he witnessed immediate accountability. "Officer Bradley, my office. Now," Holloway ordered, his voice like steel. Bradley opened his mouth to protest, but knew better than to challenge the director in front of everyone. With one last glare at James, he turned and stormed off toward the security office. James adjusted his bag and shook his head. "Guess I'll be on my way now?" Holloway turned back to him. "Miss?" "James Carter." Holloway's eyes flickered with recognition. "Dr. James Carter?" A few heads turned. The name seemed familiar to some. James smirked slightly. "The one and only." Now, the whispers grew louder. People were pulling out their phones, searching his name. Within moments, a few gasps followed. James Carter was no ordinary traveler. He was a prominent civil rights attorney, known for taking on police brutality cases and exposing corruption in law enforcement. Bradley, who had just reached the security office, suddenly felt sick to his stomach as he heard someone say, "Oh my God, that's him." Holloway exhaled, as if piecing everything together. "Mr. Carter, I deeply apologize for this." James nodded, but his expression remained firm. "An apology isn't enough, Director. This happens every day to people who don't have a name that gets attention." Holloway's jaw tightened. "You're right, and I intend to do something about it." Inside the airport security office, Officer Bradley sat stiffly in a chair, his palms sweaty. Across from him, Director Holloway stood with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. The room felt suffocatingly small, and Bradley could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Holloway's voice was eerily calm, which made it all the more intimidating. Bradley cleared his throat. "Sir, I was just doing my job. The man was acting suspicious." Holloway cut him off. "Enough. You profiled him. You escalated a situation that should never have been a situation in the first place. And worst of all, you did it to James Carter." Bradley blinked. "Wait, you mean that James Carter?" "Yes." Holloway threw a file onto the desk. "Civil rights attorney, former DOJ prosecutor. The man has taken down police departments for less than what you just pulled in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras." Bradley's stomach churned. He had heard of Carter before. His cases had made national headlines. His lawsuits had led to firings, lawsuits, and policy changes. And now, Bradley had just handed him another case on a silver platter. "What's going to happen to me?" Bradley asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Holloway let out a slow breath. "Right now, I'm suspending you pending an internal investigation." "But sir—" "No, you're lucky if that's all that happens." Meanwhile, outside, James Carter was already on his phone. He wasn't just letting this go. He knew exactly who to call, and within minutes, the media would know too. By the time James Carter left the airport, news outlets were already picking up the story. A bystander's video of the incident had gone viral within hours, racking up millions of views. The footage was damning. Officer Bradley's aggressive stance, the unnecessary pat-down, the clear contrast between how he treated Carter and the other passengers. James sat in the back of his car, his phone buzzing nonstop. Calls, texts, emails, everyone wanted a comment. But he wasn't ready to talk just yet. He had a plan. His assistant, Maya, sat beside him, scrolling through the flood of responses. "CNN, MSNBC, and even some conservative outlets want to talk to you," she said. "It's everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It's trending as airports and racism." James sighed. "Good. That means people are paying attention." He knew how these things usually played out. The airport would issue a half-hearted apology, maybe place Bradley on temporary leave, and hope the outrage would die down. But James wasn't about to let that happen. "We're filing a formal complaint first thing in the morning," he told Maya. and I want statements from every witness we can find. Maya nodded. I already started reaching out. People are eager to talk. As they pulled up to James' office, cameras and reporters swarmed the entrance. He took a deep breath before stepping out. The questions hit him like a wave. Mr. Carter, do you plan to sue? Was this racial profiling? What message do you have for the TSA? James held up a hand, silencing the crowd. I'll be addressing this soon, but let me be clear. What happened today was unacceptable, and I will be taking action. Inside the airport, Officer Bradley watched the news coverage with a sinking feeling. His career was hanging by a thread, and he knew it. Officer Bradley sat in his supervisor's office, his palms sweaty as he watched the viral video play on the screen. The footage didn't lie. It showed him targeting James Carter for no apparent reason, his condescending tone, and the humiliating way he had spoken to a respected businessman. Chief Supervisor Daniels rubbed his temples, sighing deeply. Bradley, do you have any idea how much of a mess you've created? Bradley shifted in his chair. Sir, I was just following standard procedure. Standard procedure? Daniels snapped. This wasn't just procedure, Bradley. You singled him out. And now, because of you, the entire airport is under scrutiny. Bradley swallowed hard. He had been a cop for years, but nothing like this had ever happened before. He thought about how confident he had felt when he was interrogating Carter, thinking he was in control. Now it was clear he had underestimated who he was dealing with. The mayor's office called, Daniels continued. They want an immediate response. The TSA is also investigating. And James Carter? He's talking about pressing charges. Bradley felt his stomach drop. Charges? Sir, You humiliated a powerful man on camera, Bradley, Daniels said coldly. And now you're a liability. There was a long silence before Daniels finally spoke again. You're suspended, pending investigation. Bradley shot up from his seat. Suspended, sir? You can't. Daniels stood, his expression steely. I can, and I am. You've left me no choice. As Bradley walked out of the office, his mind raced. He needed a plan, fast. His career was slipping through his fingers, and if he didn't act soon, it would be over for good. By the time Officer Bradley left the office, the video had already spread like wildfire. News outlets were running headlines about the incident, and social media was in an uproar. Airport cop caught racially profiling black businessman. Justice incoming. James Carter speaks out. This happens too often. Calls for Officer Bradley's termination intensify. People from all over the country were voicing their opinions. Some were furious, demanding Bradley be fired immediately. Others tried to defend him, but the overwhelming majority saw the incident for what it was, racial profiling at its worst. James Carter sat in his office, scrolling through the thousands of messages of support flooding his inbox. Celebrities, activists, and even politicians were reaching out, offering their backing. He had been hesitant to make a big deal out of this, but now he realized he had a responsibility. This isn't just about me, he said during an interview on a major news network. This is about the countless black men and women who go through this every day but don't have a camera to prove it. Meanwhile, at the airport, travelers were on edge. Some people hesitated to go through security, eyeing the officers with suspicion. Others walked with a newfound confidence, knowing that at least for now, the world was watching. Back at home, Bradley scrolled through the internet, his hands shaking as he read comment after comment calling for his badge. His family refused to talk to him, his friends were distant, and his colleagues, they were avoiding him like he was toxic. For the first time in his career, Bradley felt something he had never felt before. Fear. Fear that this time he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. Fear that this time he was truly out of second chances. The next morning, Officer Bradley arrived at work, his heart pounding in his chest. As soon as he stepped into the security office, he noticed something different. His coworkers barely acknowledged him. Some gave him quick glances before looking away, while others whispered in hushed tones. Then, his supervisor, Lieutenant Dawson, stepped into the room. Bradley, come with me, he said, his voice cold and firm. Bradley followed him down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. When they entered a conference room, two men in suits were already waiting. The emblem on their badges sent a chill down Bradley's spine. Internal Affairs. Officer Bradley, have a seat, one of them instructed. The interrogation began immediately. They played the video, pausing at key moments, asking Bradley to explain his actions. Every answer he gave was met with the same blank, unimpressed stares. "I was just doing my job," Bradley muttered. One of the IA officers leaned forward. Your job? Your job is to enforce airport security, not humiliate and profile passengers based on race. Your job is to ensure safety, not create unnecessary conflict. Tell me, Officer Bradley, would you have treated a white man the same way?" Bradley opened his mouth but couldn't find an answer. His usual arrogance had vanished. The IA officers exchanged glances before the lead investigator spoke. "Officer Bradley, you are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending further investigation." Bradley's stomach dropped. "Wait, you can't." "This is not a discussion," the officer cut him off. "Turn in your badge and firearm." As Bradley handed over his badge, the reality hit him. His career was crumbling before his eyes. As news of the incident spread, social media exploded with outrage. The video of Officer Bradley harassing Malcolm at the airport had gone viral overnight, amassing millions of views. People from all backgrounds flooded the comments, condemning the blatant racial profiling. "This is disgusting. He needs to be fired immediately. Another day, another black man mistreated for no reason. This officer should never work in law enforcement again." Celebrities, activists, and even politicians weighed in, demanding accountability. The pressure on the airport's administration and law enforcement agencies intensified as the story gained traction. Protesters gathered outside the airport, holding signs that read "Justice for Malcolm" and "End Racial Profiling." News channels picked up the story, replaying the footage with commentary from legal experts and civil rights advocates. Meanwhile, Malcolm sat in his hotel room, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the response. He had received hundreds of messages, some from strangers offering support, others from journalists requesting interviews. His lawyer, Jordan Matthews, advised him to stay composed and let the legal process play out. "Right now, the world is watching," Jordan said. "The more attention this gets, the harder it will be for them to sweep it under the rug." At the airport, the administration scrambled to contain the damage. The head of security, under immense public pressure, released a statement announcing that Officer Bradley's actions were under investigation and that they do not reflect the values of the organization. But the public wasn't satisfied. They wanted more than an investigation. They wanted justice. And as the protests grew louder, it became clear that this wasn't just about Malcolm. It was about every person who had ever been unfairly targeted. The airport's administration, feeling the weight of public outrage, had no choice but to take action. Less than 24 hours after the incident, they announced that Officer Bradley was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. But the public wasn't fooled. Social media users quickly pointed out that administrative leave was often just a way to let officers quietly return to their jobs after the outrage died down. The pressure didn't ease. In fact, it intensified. Malcolm, meanwhile, found himself in the center of a storm he never asked for. His phone buzzed nonstop with interview requests from major news outlets. Jordan Matthews, his lawyer, advised him to choose wisely. "We need to be strategic about this," Jordan said. "The right platform can push this case in the direction we want." Malcolm agreed to appear on a well-known morning show where the host asked him to walk through the incident. He calmly recounted the moment Officer Bradley stopped him, accused him of fraud, and humiliated him in front of a crowd. "I was just trying to board my flight," Malcolm said. "I had all my documents. I complied. But it wasn't enough." The interview only added fuel to the fire. More people rallied behind him, and hashtags like "Justice for Malcolm" and "Fire Bradley Now" trended across social media. At the airport, Officer Bradley's world was crumbling. He never imagined his actions would make national headlines. His colleagues avoided him, and his superiors were no longer defending him. He was summoned for an internal review meeting where he was asked point blank, "Why did you stop, Mr. Brooks?" Bradley had no good answer. He stammered through excuses, claiming he was just doing his job. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had judged Malcolm based on his race, and now he was paying the price. As the pressure mounted, the airport's Internal Affairs Department launched a full-scale investigation into Officer Bradley's actions. The review committee, made up of senior officials, legal experts, and an independent civil rights advisor, wasted no time in gathering evidence. Security footage from the airport was analyzed frame by frame. Investigators could clearly see Malcolm presenting his ID, his credit card, and his ticket, only for Officer Bradley to remain hostile and aggressive. There was no sign of any crime, no valid reason for suspicion. Interviews were conducted with witnesses, including airport staff and travelers who had seen the confrontation. Several people confirmed that they had felt uncomfortable watching how Bradley treated Malcolm. One woman, a middle-aged teacher, shared her account. "I was right there. The officer never looked at any of the white passengers with the same scrutiny. It was clear what was happening." Officer Bradley, meanwhile, sat through a grueling interrogation. His superiors bombarded him with questions. What made you suspect Mr. Brooks of fraud? Why did you threaten him when he provided proof? Did you make similar checks on other passengers? Bradley's responses were weak. He tried to claim he had a gut feeling about Malcolm, but that wasn't enough. The investigators weren't buying it. The deeper they dug, the worse it got for him. Past complaints against Bradley surfaced, incidents where he had unfairly profiled people of color. By the end of the meeting, it was clear Bradley was in serious trouble. His career wasn't just at risk, it was hanging by a thread. News of the investigation spread like wildfire. Major media outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the footage of Officer Bradley harassing Malcolm at the airport. The video, already viral on social media, now made its way onto national television. Racial profiling at the airport? Shocking footage raises serious questions about law enforcement practices, one news anchor stated. Journalists reached out to Malcolm for an interview, and after careful consideration, he agreed to speak. Sitting across from a well-known reporter, Malcolm shared his experience with a calm but firm voice. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about the thousands of people who go through this every day but don't have a camera or a platform to prove it." His words struck a chord with viewers. People flooded social media with support, demanding accountability from the airport and law enforcement. Activists called for policy changes to prevent racial discrimination in security procedures. Meanwhile, Officer Bradley's world was crumbling. His name and face were everywhere, and the public wasn't on his side. Protesters gathered outside the airport, holding signs that read, "Justice for Malcolm Brooks," and "End racial profiling now." As the media pressure intensified, the airport administration was forced to respond. In a press conference, an official made a statement. "We take these allegations seriously. Officer Bradley has been placed on administrative leave while the investigation continues." But the people weren't satisfied. They wanted more than just a suspension. They wanted real consequences. As Malcolm watched the news unfold, he knew one thing for sure. This was bigger than just one incident. This was a fight for justice. The pressure on Officer Bradley and the airport authorities only grew stronger. Every major news network was covering the story, and social media continued to explode with discussions about racial profiling in law enforcement. Protesters didn't back down. They camped outside the airport, demanding real consequences. "Fire Bradley now," and "Justice for Malcolm" were common chants echoing through the terminals. Travelers joined the movement, refusing to stay silent. Inside the police department, the tension was palpable. Officers whispered about the situation, knowing this wasn't something that would blow over. Bradley sat in a small meeting room, sweating as internal affairs investigators bombarded him with questions. "Did you target Malcolm Brooks based on his race? Why did you demand his identification when others were left alone? Were you aware he was a successful businessman before you harassed him?" Bradley stumbled over his words, trying to defend himself. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, but his usual excuses weren't working this time. Meanwhile, Malcolm was invited to speak at a community town hall about racial discrimination. He stood before a packed audience, his voice steady and strong. "This isn't just about one bad officer. This is about a system that allows these abuses to continue. We need real change, and it starts with holding people accountable." The crowd erupted in applause. Civil rights lawyers, activists, and politicians took note. The calls for Bradley's dismissal became louder. Then the final blow came. An airport spokesperson announced a major press conference for the next morning. The rumors spread fast. Officer Bradley's fate was about to be decided. The next morning, reporters and cameras swarmed outside the airport as the press conference began. The airport director, alongside police officials, stepped forward to address the crowd. After a thorough investigation into the events involving Officer Bradley and Mr. Malcolm Brooks, we have reached a decision. The tension in the air was thick. Everyone waited for the inevitable. Then, the announcement came. Officer Bradley has been officially terminated from his position, effective immediately. His actions do not align with the standards we uphold, and we will not tolerate racial discrimination within our ranks. The crowd outside the airport erupted in cheers. Protesters who had spent days demanding justice hugged each other. Social media lit up with messages of celebration. The headlines were everywhere. Officer fired after racial profiling incident at airport. Bradley, watching from home, felt his stomach drop. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was gone in an instant. No department would hire him after this. His phone rang constantly, but he ignored the messages. He had lost everything because of his own prejudice. Meanwhile, Malcolm Brooks stood victorious. He wasn't just a businessman, he had become a symbol of resilience. He used the momentum to push for policy changes in airport security, advocating for fair treatment of all passengers. "This isn't the end," Malcolm told the media. "It's just the beginning of something bigger. We will make sure no one else has to go through what I did." And with that, the story of Officer Bradley's downfall and Malcolm's triumph became a lesson in accountability, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. If this story resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that expose injustice and inspire change. Your support helps spread awareness and hold people accountable. Drop a comment below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Let's start the conversation. Turn on notifications so you never miss an eye-opening story. Together, we can make a difference. One story at a time.